Hi, I am Ghazal Kharoub from grade 11 AG, and today I am going to be presenting my biology performance task about fermentation. Okay, so the topics we are going to be discussing is what is fermentation, what are the types of fermentation, what is the difference between lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation, and fermentation formula. Okay, first of all, what is fermentation? Fermentation is a metabolic pathway where microorganisms convert sugars into energy without oxygen, producing alcohol or acids, um, or without any electron transport chain. And they also create products like beer, yogurt, and bread. Now, what is a fermentation process? Um, the fermentation process is basically fermentation pathways regenerate the coenzyme, which is NAD positive, which is used the coenzyme positive, which is used in glycolysis to release energy in the form of ATP. Fermentation only yields a net of 2 ATP per glucose molecule through glycolysis, while aerobic respiration yields as many as 32 molecules of ATP per glucose molecule with the aid of electron transport chain. Now, fermentation function. The main function of fermentation is to convert NADH back into the coenzyme NAD positive so that it can be used again for glycolysis. Also, during fermentation, an organic electron acceptor, such as pyruvate, reacts with NADH to form NAD positive, generating products such as carbon dioxide and ethanol, which is also ethanol fermentation, or lactate, which is lactic acid fermentation in the process. Now we have types of fermentation. There are many types of fermentation that are distinguished by the end products formed from pyruvate. The two fermentations most commonly used by humans to produce commercial foods are number one, ethanol fermentations, which is used in beers and bread, and number two, lactic acid fermentation, which is used to flavor and perceive dairy and vegetables. You can see like cheese as an example. Okay, number one, alcoholic fermentation. So here is the process of alcoholic fermentation is the picture that I pasted. So alcoholic fermentation begins with glycolysis, where a glucose molecule is broken down into two molecules of pyruvate. In the absence of oxygen, these pyruvate molecules undergo further conversion. First, they lose carbon dioxide to become acetaldehyde. Then acetaldehyde is reduced in ethanol, regenerating NAD positive from NADH in the process. This entire sequence enables the cell to generate energy and produce ethanol as a byproduct. Also, ethanol fermentation is typically performed by yeast, which is a unicellular fungus. Now we have number two, lactic acid fermentation. So there are two main types of lactic acid fermentation. Number one, homolactic, and number two, heterolactic. In homolactic acid fermentation, NADH reduces pyruvate directly to form lactate. This process does not release gas. Now, in the heterolactic fermentation, some lactic is further metabolized, resulting in ethanol and carbon dioxide via a key enzyme called phosphoketolase pathway. Lactic acid fermentation is primarily performed by certain types of bacteria and fungi. However, this type of fermentation also occurs in the muscle cell to produce ATP when the oxygen supply has been deleted during exercise and aerobic respiration is not possible. also, like lactic acid fermentation is a metabolic pathway where sugars such as glucose are converted into lactic acid. This anaerobic pathway is commonly employed by certain bacteria and muscle cells. In detail, during glycolysis, glucose is broken down into pyruvate. Instead of further metabolizing into carbon dioxide and ethanol, pyruvate is directly reduced to lactic acid. This regenerates NAD positive and NADP and NADH, allowing glycolysis to continue in the absence of oxygen. Lactic acid fermentation is significant in the production of foods like yogurt and contributes to muscle energy metabolism during exercise. Now, what are the similarities and differences between lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation? Similarities is number 1, both start with pyruvate from glycolysis. Number 2, both create an NAD positive to be sent back to glycolysis. And number 3, neither make any ATP on their own. Now, what are the similarities and differences between lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation? The differences are lactic acid is made and does not give off CO2. And number 2, alcohol makes ethanol and gives off CO2. Now we have the fermentation equation. The ethanol equation is C6H12O6, which is glucose, formed into 2-ethanol, which is 2C2H5O5, plus 2 carbon dioxide, which is 2 CO2. Now the lactic acid fermentation is glucose, which is C6H12O6, formed into 2C3H6O3, which is lactic acid. And what are the products of fermentation? The products of fermentation are ethanol, lactic acid, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen gas. And that is it. Here is my resource that I use. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was beneficial and helped you understand fermentation.